The courtroom fell silent when the doors swung open. Brent Ellison had spent 2 years planning this moment. 2 years hiding money. 2 years fabricating evidence. 2 years making sure his pregnant wife would walk away with nothing. He had isolated her from everyone who loved her. He had made her believe her own family was the enemy. He had hired expensive lawyers, bribed a psychiatrist, and built a case so airtight that even her own attorney was ready to surrender. Margot stood alone, 8 months pregnant, no money, no witnesses, no hope. Brent looked at her across the courtroom and smiled, the smile of a man who had already won. And then the doors opened. 5 people walked in. Her father, a forensic accountant who had spent 15 years catching criminals for the FBI. Her mother, a woman who knew every secret of the family court system. Her brother, one of Chicago's most feared litigation attorneys. Her sister, a cybersecurity expert who could recover files Brent thought he had deleted forever. And her grandmother, 82 years old, walking with a silver cane, carrying secrets of her own. Brent's smile disappeared because Margot had done something he never expected, something he had spent 3 years making sure she would never do. She had asked for help, and her family had come. What happened next would destroy everything Brent had built, every lie, every hidden account, every fabricated piece of evidence. This is the story of a woman they thought was powerless. They were wrong. Story value and lesson. Before we begin, here is what this story will teach you. Asking for help is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength. The people who love you are waiting for you to call. They have always been waiting, and the person who tries to isolate you from everyone, who makes you believe you are alone, that person is not protecting you. They are trapping you. This story is for every woman who has ever felt powerless. Every woman who has been told she is crazy when she knew she was not. Every woman who looked in the mirror and did not recognize herself anymore. You are not alone. You have never been alone, and your story is not over. Now, let us begin. The courthouse doors felt heavier at 8 months pregnant. Margot Ellison paused at the bottom of the stone steps, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other gripping the cold metal railing. The January wind cut through her thin wool coat. She should have worn something warmer. She should have done a lot of things differently. The building loomed above her like a monument to every mistake she had ever made. Limestone columns, brass fixtures tarnished by decades of rain, a statue of Lady Justice standing blind and indifferent above the entrance. Margot took a breath, then another. The baby kicked, a sharp jab beneath her ribs that made her wince. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're okay." She wasn't sure which one of them she was trying to convince. Her attorney, Victoria Hayes, appeared at the top of the steps. Victoria was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on her forehead. She looked worried. She always looked worried these days. "Margot." Victoria hurried down to meet her. "We need to talk before we go inside." "What happened?" Victoria glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Brent's team filed new motions this morning. 3 of them." Margot's stomach tightened. "What kind of motions?" "The first one requests a psychological evaluation. They're claiming you're mentally unstable." The words hit Margot like a physical blow. She gripped the railing harder. "That's not true," she said. "He knows that's not true. I know." Victoria's voice was gentle but strained. "The second motion requests temporary emergency custody. They want the court to award Brent custody of the baby the moment she's born." Margot felt the blood drain from her face. "They can't do that." "They can try." In the third motion, Victoria paused. She looked like she was about to deliver news of a death. "They're requesting a competency hearing. They want to argue that you're unfit to make decisions about your own finances. Margot stared at her attorney. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She didn't brush it away. "He's trying to take everything," she said. "Yes." Victoria nodded slowly. "I think he is." They climbed the steps together. Margot moved carefully, watching each stair, aware of her shifted center of gravity. 8 months pregnant, 32 years old, about to face the man who had promised to love her forever in a battle that would determine the rest of her life. The lobby echoed with footsteps and murmured conversations. Margot smelled coffee from a nearby vending machine, burned and bitter. Stale air circulated through ancient vents. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. She saw them before they saw her. Brent stood near the security checkpoint, surrounded by 3 men in expensive suits. His legal team. Douglas Crane, the lead attorney, was a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and the confident stance of someone who had never lost anything important. The other 2 were younger, sharper, carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than Margot's car. And there was Judith, Brent's mother, 64 years old, with perfectly coiffed hair and a pearl necklace that she touched whenever she wanted to remind people of her breeding. She stood beside her son like a sentinel, her thin lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. But it was the 5th person who made Margot's breath catch in her throat. Tiffany Vance, 28, blonde, beautiful in that effortless way that Margot had never quite managed. She was standing slightly behind Brent, holding a tablet, pretending to be nothing more than his office manager. Margot knew better. She had known better for 6 months now, ever since she found the text messages on Brent's phone. The ones he thought he had deleted, the ones that detailed exactly what kind of relationship he had with his assistant. Brent looked up. Their eyes met across the marble lobby. He smiled. It was the same smile he had given her on their wedding day, the same smile he had given her when he told her they were trying for a baby, the same smile he had given her 1,000 times before she understood what it really meant. It meant he was winning. Judith leaned close to her son and whispered something. Her voice carried across the lobby in that particular way that was clearly intentional. "She looks terrible. No wonder he found someone else." Tiffany covered her mouth, hiding a laugh. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Margot kept walking, one foot in front of the other. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. Victoria guided her toward a bench in a quiet alcove. "Sit down for a minute, catch your breath." Margot sat. The wooden bench was hard and cold through her dress. She reached for her phone automatically. She checked the screen. No messages. She locked it, unlocked it, locked it again, unlocked it. No one was coming to help her. She had made sure of that 3 years ago when she cut off every person who had ever loved her. Her father, her mother, her brother, her sister, her grandmother. All of them erased from her life because Brent had convinced her they were toxic, controlling, jealous of her happiness. And she had believed him. God help her. She had believed every word. "Margot," Victoria sat down beside her. "I need you to understand what we're facing in there." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because Brent has resources we don't have. He has expert witnesses lined up, character witnesses, financial analysts who will testify that you contributed nothing to the marriage." "I worked," Margot said quietly. "For 5 years, I worked at the museum." "You quit 2 years ago. Brent's team is going to argue that was your choice, that you became dependent on him voluntarily." "He asked me to quit. He said he wanted me home. He said we were trying to start a family." "I believe you," Victoria sighed. "But belief doesn't win court cases. Evidence does. Margot looked down at her hands. Her wedding ring was gone. She had pawned it 3 weeks ago to pay Victoria's retainer. The pale band of skin where it used to sit still looked naked and strange. "What evidence do they have?" she asked. Victoria opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Text messages, taken out of context but damaging. Medical records showing you were treated for anxiety 2 years ago. A statement from a neighbor claiming she heard you screaming at Brent regularly. That neighbor is Judith's friend. She moved in 6 months ago. She's never spoken to me once. I know. We'll challenge the credibility. But Margot, Victoria paused. They're painting a picture. And right now, that picture shows a woman who isolated herself from her family, quit her job, developed mental health issues, and became increasingly erratic. Brent did that, Margot said. Her voice cracked. He made me think my family was dangerous. He made me quit my job so I would depend on him. He made me feel crazy. I believe you, Victoria said again. But without proof of financial manipulation, without testimony from people who knew you before, without something concrete to counter their narrative. She trailed off. We lose. Victoria didn't deny it. A shadow fell across them. Douglas Crane stood there, blocking the light, smiling with too many teeth. Mrs. Ellison. His voice was smooth as oil. Might I have a word? Victoria stood up. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of me. Of course, of course. Douglas waved a hand dismissively. I simply wanted to offer Mrs. Ellison an opportunity, a chance to avoid the unpleasantness of a prolonged legal battle. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Cream-colored paper. Expensive. $50,000, he said. Sign away your claims to the marital assets. Agree to joint custody with primary residence going to Mr. Ellison. Walk away with your dignity intact. Margot stared at the envelope. $50,000. After 6 years of marriage, after giving up her career, her family, her entire identity for Brent Ellison. $50,000. No, she said. Douglas's smile flickered, just for a moment. Mrs. Ellison, I urge you to reconsider. You have no family support, no financial resources, no one coming to help you fight this battle. He leaned closer. His cologne was expensive and overwhelming. Take the deal, he said softly, before things get worse. Margot looked up at him. This man in his $3,000 suit, this man who had probably never been 8 months pregnant and terrified and alone in his entire life. No, she said again. Douglas straightened. The smile disappeared entirely. Very well. He tucked the envelope back into his jacket. I tried to warn you. He walked away. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor like a countdown to something terrible. Victoria sat back down. Are you sure about this? Margot wasn't sure about anything. She wasn't sure she could win. She wasn't sure she could survive another 6 months of this. She wasn't sure the baby growing inside her would ever know a world where her parents weren't at war, but she was sure about one thing. He doesn't get to erase me, she said. Not without a fight. The courtroom doors opened in the distance. A bailiff stepped out and called the first case of the day. Not hers. Not yet. Margot closed her eyes and rested her hand on her belly. The baby shifted, a slow roll that felt like a question. It's just us, she whispered. Just you and me. She had never felt more alone in her entire life. 3 years earlier, Margot had believed she was the luckiest woman in the world. The memory surfaced unbidden as she sat in that courthouse hallway. Her 29th birthday. The restaurant Brent had chosen. White tablecloths and candles, and a sommelier who treated every wine selection like a sacred ritual. I have something to tell you, Brent had said, reaching across the table to take her hand. Your father called me today. Margot had frozen. What? He wanted to know our plans for the holidays. I told him we hadn't decided yet. Brent's thumb traced circles on her palm. He got aggressive, Margot. Started demanding that we spend Christmas with them. Started saying things about me. About us. What kinds of things? He thinks I'm controlling you. He thinks I'm the reason you don't call as often anymore. Brent shook his head, sadly. I told him that's not true, that you're your own person, that you make your own choices, but he wouldn't listen. Margot remembered the confusion she had felt. Her father had always been protective, sometimes too protective, but aggressive? I should call him, she said. Of course. Brent squeezed her hand. But baby, I need you to think about something first. Every time we talk about your family, you get stressed. Your anxiety spikes. You stop sleeping well. That's not because of them, isn't it? Brent's voice was gentle. So gentle. Your mother criticizes everything you do. Your brother acts like I'm not good enough for you. And your father, he sighed. Your father has never accepted that you're an adult who can make her own decisions. They love me. I know they do, in their own way. Brent released her hand and leaned back. I just wonder if their way of loving you is actually good for you. The seed had been planted that night. Margot hadn't recognized it at the time. She had defended her family, argued with Brent, even called her father the next day. But the call had been strange. Her father did seem frustrated. He did ask pointed questions about Brent's work, about their finances, about why Margot had turned down a promotion at the museum. Dad, I'm happy, she had said. Are you? Because you sound different, sweetheart. You sound smaller. She had hung up, angry. She had told Brent about the conversation, and Brent had held her while she cried, whispering that he understood, that he would never try to control her the way her father did. The manipulation was so slow, so careful, so invisible until it was too late. By her 30th birthday, Margot only spoke to her family on holidays. By her 31st birthday, she didn't speak to them at all. They don't want you to be happy, Brent had said, over and over. They want to control you. I'm the only one who sees you for who you really are. And she had believed him. God, she had believed him with every fiber of her being. Now, sitting in the courthouse 3 years later, Margot could see the pattern clearly. Every fight about her family had been engineered. Every concern about their behavior had been calculated. Brent had taken 3 years to build a prison around her, and she had helped him lay every single brick. Victoria returned with 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine. The liquid was lukewarm and tasted like cardboard. The hearing starts in 20 minutes, Victoria said. Are you ready to go over the timeline again? Can I ask you something first? Of course. Margot wrapped her hands around the paper cup. The heat seeped into her cold fingers. When did you know? She asked. When did you know what kind of person Brent really was? Victoria was quiet for a moment. The first time I met him. What? In my office? 2 months ago. He came with you to the initial consultation, remember? He kept answering questions I asked you. He kept touching your arm whenever you started to speak. He kept looking at me like he expected me to be impressed by him. I don't remember that. You wouldn't. Victoria's voice was sad. When you're in it, you can't see it. That's how it works. Margot stared into her coffee. Her reflection stared back, distorted and strange. I chose him over everyone, she said softly. My parents, my brother and sister, my grandmother. I told myself they were the problem. I told myself Brent was protecting me from them. You were manipulated. I was stupid. No. Victoria's voice was firm. You were targeted. There's a difference. Men like Brent don't just stumble into relationships. They choose women who are kind and trusting and want to believe the best in people. Then they exploit those qualities systematically. Margot thought about the wedding, the small ceremony at a resort in Maine. None of her family had been invited. Brent had convinced her it would be easier that way. Less drama, less stress. She remembered Judith crying happy tears, Brent's business partners raising champagne glasses, and herself standing in a white dress that cost more than 3 months of her old salary, believing she was starting a new life with the man of her dreams. The man of her dreams had been hiding assets from her for 2 years. The man of her dreams had been sleeping with his office manager for at least 18 months. The man of her dreams was now trying to take her baby and leave her with nothing. A door opened down the hallway. One of Brent's junior attorneys emerged, spotted them, and hurried back inside. "They're nervous," Victoria observed. "About what?" "They're winning." "They're winning because you have no resources. If that changed, the entire case would change." "How exactly would that change?" Margot asked. "I have no money, no expert witnesses, no character witnesses, except Sloane and she." She stopped. Sloane, her best friend from college. The one person besides Brent who had been at her wedding. They hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since Sloane stopped returning her calls without explanation. "What about Sloane?" Victoria asked. "Nothing." Margot shook her head. She disappeared. Everyone disappears eventually. They sat in silence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Each second brought them closer to the courtroom. Margot's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She opened it and felt her heart stop. 3 words. 3 words that changed everything. "He threatened me." Before Margot could respond, the message disappeared, deleted remotely by whoever had sent it. But she had seen it. She knew the number. She had memorized it years ago. Sloane. "Mrs. Ellison?" A bailiff appeared in the hallway. "We're ready for you in courtroom 6. Victoria stood and gathered her papers. "Margot, are you all right?" Margot looked at her phone. The message was gone, but the words still burned in her mind. "He threatened me." "I'm fine," she said. "Let's go." She followed Victoria toward the courtroom, her mind racing. Sloane had been threatened. By Brent? It had to be Brent. That was why she stopped calling. That was why she disappeared. How many other people had Brent scared away? How many people had tried to warn Margot and been silenced before they could speak? The courtroom doors loomed ahead. Massive oak panels carved with symbols of justice and truth. Margot paused with her hand on the handle. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than fear. She felt angry. The door swung open. The courtroom smelled like old wood and paper and the faint chemical tang of cleaning products. Rows of wooden benches stretched toward a raised platform where Judge Patricia Whitmore already sat, reviewing documents. Brent was seated at the left table with his army of lawyers. He turned when Margot entered. That smile again. That terrible, triumphant smile. "I'm not crazy," Margot thought. "I know what he did. I know what he is." She took her seat at the right table beside Victoria. The wood was smooth beneath her palms. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if sensing her mother's shift in energy. Judge Whitmore looked up. She was a stern woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had been a family court judge for 23 years. She had seen everything. "We're here today for a preliminary hearing in the matter of Ellison versus Ellison," she announced. "I've reviewed the motions filed by both parties. Before we proceed, are there any matters either side wishes to raise?" Douglas Crane stood immediately. "Your Honor, We'd like to address our motion for emergency custody evaluation. Margot's hands curled into fists beneath the table. The battle was about to begin. Douglas Crane spoke for 20 minutes. He painted a picture of Margot that she barely recognized. A woman who had grown increasingly erratic over the past 2 years. A woman who had alienated her entire family. A woman who had shown signs of instability that made her unsuitable for the responsibilities of motherhood. He presented text messages, screen captures of conversations between Margot and Brent, carefully edited to remove context. As you can see, Your Honor, Mrs. Ellison repeatedly threatened to harm herself during arguments with my client. Margot wanted to scream. Those messages had been taken from a single night, the night she had discovered the affair, when she had texted Brent that she felt like dying. She hadn't meant it literally. She had meant that the pain was unbearable, that her heart was breaking. But stripped of context, presented in black and white on a projector screen, the words looked damning. Douglas continued. Medical records showing Margot had been prescribed anti-anxiety medication 2 years ago. A statement from the neighbor, sworn and notarized, claiming she heard Margot screaming at Brent multiple times per week. A letter from Judith Ellison expressing deep concern about her daughter-in-law's mental state. Victoria objected where she could. The neighbor had moved in recently. The medical records proved nothing except that Margot had experienced normal anxiety. The mother-in-law was hardly an unbiased witness, but Judge Whitmore listened to everything with an unreadable expression. And when Douglas finally sat down, she made notes on her legal pad without comment. Then it was Victoria's turn. Your Honor, my client is a woman who has been systematically isolated and financially controlled by her husband for 6 years. The erratic behavior described by opposing counsel is actually the predictable response of someone experiencing emotional abuse. She presented what little evidence they had. Margot's employment history showing steady, responsible work before she quit at Brent's request. Financial records showing that every joint account had been emptied and redirected to accounts in Brent's name alone. Screenshots of text messages from Brent that were controlling, demanding, manipulative. But it wasn't enough. Margot could see that clearly. Without a forensic accountant to trace the hidden assets, without witnesses to corroborate the emotional abuse, they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Judge Whitmore called a 30-minute recess. Margot walked to the bathroom on legs that felt like they might collapse at any moment. She pushed through the heavy door and found herself alone in a room of white tile and fluorescent lights. She gripped the edge of the sink and stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, hair that had lost its shine somewhere along the way. When had she become this person? When had she stopped recognizing herself? The bathroom door opened. Tiffany Vance walked in. They stared at each other across the white tile floor. I wasn't going to come in here, Tiffany said finally, but I saw you leave, and I... She stopped. Never mind. This is stupid. She turned to go. Wait. Tiffany paused with her hand on the door. Did he tell you I was crazy? Margot asked. Is that what he said about me? Tiffany didn't turn around. He said a lot of things. Like what? That you were unstable. That you threatened him. That he was afraid of what you might do. Margot let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Do I look like someone who could threaten anyone? I'm 8 months pregnant. I can barely climb a flight of stairs. Tiffany finally turned. Her perfect face was troubled. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone crazy, I guess. Someone dangerous. She shook her head. You just look tired. I am tired. Margot's voice broke. I'm tired of being lied to. I'm tired of being lied about. I'm tired of standing in a courtroom while people say things about me that aren't true. Tiffany was quiet for a long moment. Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty. Maybe guilt. He's not going to stop, she said finally. You know that, right? Brent never stops until he gets what he wants. What does he want? Everything. He wants everything and everyone to bend to his will. Tiffany glanced toward the door nervously. I shouldn't be talking to you if he finds out. You could help me. Margot took a step forward. You know things about the accounts, about his plans. You could... I can't. Tiffany's voice sharpened with fear. You don't understand. He has things on me, things that would destroy my career, my life. So you're just going to let him destroy mine? Tiffany's hand was on the door handle again. I'm sorry, I really am, but I can't help you. The door opened. Judith Ellison stood on the other side, her eyes narrowing when she saw the two of them together. Tiffany! Her voice was ice. Douglas is looking for you. Tiffany slipped past her without another word. Judith remained, blocking the doorway, staring at Margot with open contempt. Whatever you think you're doing, Judith said softly, it won't work. My son is a good man, a successful man, and you. She looked Margot up and down. You're nothing. You were nothing when he found you, and you'll be nothing when this is over. She walked away. Her heels clicked against the tile floor like a metronome counting down the seconds until Margot's complete destruction. Margot turned back to the mirror. Her hands were shaking. Her reflection blurred as tears filled her eyes. She thought about the good times, the memories that felt tainted now Paris. Brent had taken her to Paris for their second anniversary. They had walked along the Seine at sunset. He had bought her flowers from a street vendor. He had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. He had been closing a deal with hidden investors that whole trip. She knew that now. The romantic getaway had been a cover for moving money into offshore accounts. The anniversary gift, a necklace with a diamond pendant. She had cried when he gave it to her. The necklace was in his mother's safe deposit box. It had never been hers. Nothing had ever been hers. Every sweet memory was a lie wrapped in silk. Every I love you had been a strategy. She had given him 6 years of her life, and he had spent every single day planning how to destroy her. Margot gripped the sink harder. The porcelain was cold under her fingers. She counted the tiles on the floor. 1, 2, 3, 27 tiles total. She counted them again. 27. She counted them 3 times, as if the number might change, as if anything could change. The baby kicked, a gentle tap this time, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. Margot took a shaky breath, then another. She splashed cold water on her face. She straightened her dress. She looked at her reflection one more time. You are not nothing, she said aloud. You are not what he says you are. The words felt hollow, but she said them anyway. She walked back to the courtroom. Victoria was waiting for her, looking even more worried than before. Margot, we have a problem. What now? I just received this from opposing counsel. Victoria handed her a document. They're claiming you threatened to harm yourself and the baby. They have a witness. Margot scanned the paper. A sworn statement from someone named Dr. Gerald Matthews, a psychiatrist, claiming he had evaluated Margot 6 months ago and found her to be at high risk for self-harm. I've never met this person, Margot said. I've never been to see a psychiatrist. They're fabricating evidence. Victoria's voice was grim. It's going to be your word against his. But it's a lie. It's all lies. I know, but lies with documentation carry more weight than truth without it. Judge Whitmore was returning to her seat. The bailiff called the room to order. Margot sat down at the table. Her hands were trembling, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Brent leaned over and whispered something to Douglas. Both men smiled. The next 2 hours were a blur of testimony and objections and legal jargon that made Margot's head spin. Doctor. Matthews took the stand and lied smoothly about sessions that never happened. The neighbor testified about screaming matches that had never occurred. Judith wept delicately as she expressed fear for her future grandchild. And Margot sat there, silent, powerless, watching her life be systematically dismantled by people who had never cared about her at all. By the time Judge Whitmore called for another recess, Margot felt empty, hollowed out, like someone had reached inside her and scooped out everything that made her human. Victoria guided her to a bench in the hallway. We need to talk about settlement. I already said no. That was before. Victoria sat down heavily. Margot, I believe you. I believe everything you've told me. But belief doesn't win cases. We're losing. Badly. So that's it? I just give up? I'm not saying give up. I'm saying we need to be realistic. Victoria pulled out the envelope Douglas had offered earlier. $50,000 joint custody. It's not what you deserve, but it's something. Margot stared at the envelope. 3 hours ago, she had refused it without hesitation. Now, battered and broken by the assault of lies in that courtroom, she understood why Douglas had been so confident. He knew they would win. They were always going to win. Can I have a minute? Margot asked. Victoria nodded and walked away to make a phone call. Margot sat alone on the bench. The courthouse buzzed with activity around her. People rushing to hearings, lawyers conferring with clients, justice being served and denied in equal measure behind closed doors. She thought about what Tiffany had said. He's not going to stop. Brent never stops until he gets what he wants. She thought about what her father had said 3 years ago. You sound smaller. She thought about her mother, her brother, her sister, her grandmother, all the people she had pushed away because Brent told her they were toxic. What if she called them? What if she reached out right now and asked for help? The thought made her chest tight with shame. 3 years of silence. 3 years of choosing Brent over every single person who had loved her first. They probably hated her. They had every right to hate her. But what if they didn't? Margot pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely navigate to her contacts. She found her father's number, still saved after all these years, still there waiting. She pressed call before she could lose her nerve. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Hi, you've reached Warren Ashford. Leave a message. Her father's voice. Unchanged, familiar, warm. Margot felt tears spill down her cheeks. Dad? Her voice cracked. Dad, it's me. It's Margot. I know I don't deserve to call you. I know I've been awful. I know you probably never want to hear from me again. She paused, wiped her face, tried to breathe. But I need help. I'm in trouble, and I don't know what to do. I'm at the county courthouse, and Brent, he's trying to take everything. And I'm alone. I'm so alone, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. The words tumbled out in a broken rush, years of silence, years of shame, years of believing lies. I'm sorry I chose him over you. I'm sorry I shut you out. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening until it was too late. Please, Dad. Please, I need you. I need all of you. The voicemail beeped. Time limit reached. Message ended. Margot lowered the phone slowly. She stared at the screen. No callback. No response. Just silence. What had she expected? A miracle? 3 years of nothing, and now she wanted them to drop everything and rush to save her. She was a fool. She had always been a fool. The bathroom was nearby. Margot walked toward it mechanically. She needed a moment. Just a moment alone before she had to go back into that courtroom and watch the rest of her life be taken from her. She pushed through the door, found a stall, closed the lock behind her, and then she broke. Sobs tore through her body. Silent, desperate, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it feels like dying. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold tile floor. Her belly pressed against her legs. The baby moved restlessly, sensing her distress. 8 months pregnant, 32 years old, completely alone. She had done this to herself. She had believed the lies. She had pushed away everyone who loved her. And now she was sitting on a bathroom floor in a courthouse, crying so hard she couldn't breathe, while the man who had destroyed her celebrated his victory on the other side of the wall. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the baby. "I'm so sorry. You deserve better than this. You deserve better than me." She sat there for a long time. The tile was cold. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere outside, a phone rang. Life continued, indifferent to her despair. Finally, slowly, she pulled herself together, wiped her face with toilet paper, took shaking breaths until she could stand without her legs giving out. She looked at her phone one more time. Still no callback. They weren't coming. No one was coming. She had to face this alone. Court reconvened at 2:15 in the afternoon. Margot took her seat beside Victoria with the numb resignation of someone walking to the gallows. The fight had gone out of her. What was the point of fighting when you had already lost everything that mattered? Judge Whitmore shuffled papers at her bench. Douglas Crane whispered something to Brent that made them both laugh. Judith sat in the gallery, behind them, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, maintaining her performance of the concerned mother-in-law. "Before we continue," Judge Whitmore said, "I'd like to address the settlement offer on the table. Mrs. Ellison, have you had time to consider Mr. Crane's proposal?" Victoria nudged Margot's arm. "Margot, you need to respond." Margot stood slowly. Her legs felt weak. Her voice felt trapped somewhere in her chest. "Your Honor." She paused, took a breath. "I need to say something." Judge Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "Everything they've said about me is a lie." Margot's voice was barely above a whisper. "The text messages were taken out of context. I've never met Dr. Matthews. I've never been evaluated by a psychiatrist. The neighbor who testified moved in 6 months ago and has never spoken to me." Douglas Crane stood. "Your Honor, if Mrs. Ellison wants to contest the evidence, she should do so through proper legal channels, not theatrical outbursts." "I'm not having an outburst," Margot said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm telling the truth. My husband has been planning this divorce for at least 2 years. He has hidden assets in shell companies. He has fabricated evidence to make me look unstable. He has threatened anyone who tried to help me." "Do you have proof of these allegations?" Judge Whitmore asked. "No?" Margot felt her brief surge of courage fading. "I don't have proof. I don't have money for investigators or forensic accountants. I don't have any witnesses because everyone who might have helped me has either been scared away or manipulated into silence." "Your Honor," Douglas said smoothly, "this is exactly the kind of erratic behavior we've been documenting. Paranoid accusations without evidence, conspiracy theories about hidden assets. This is precisely why we're concerned about Mrs. Ellison's fitness as a parent." Margot wanted to scream. They twisted everything. Every word she said became proof of her instability. It was a trap with no exit. "Sit down, Mrs. Ellison." Judge Whitmore's voice was not unkind. "I understand this is a difficult situation, but Mr. Crane is correct that accusations require evidence." Margot sat. Victoria put a hand on her arm. "You did fine," she whispered. "It's on the record now. But Being on the record meant nothing. Being on the record didn't change the fact that they were losing, that Brent had outmaneuvered her at every turn. Judge Whitmore continued with procedural matters, dates for future hearings, deadlines for additional filings, the mechanics of divorce playing out in formal language, while Margot's world crumbled around her. And then, in the middle of a discussion about temporary support payments, the courtroom doors opened. Margot didn't look up at first. People came and went during hearings. It wasn't unusual. But she heard Douglas Crane stop mid-sentence. She heard the sudden silence that fell over the room. She heard Judith's sharp intake of breath. She looked up. A man stood in the doorway, 60 years old, silver hair cropped short, a suit that wasn't fancy but fit him perfectly, eyes that Margot would recognize anywhere. Her father. Behind him, her mother, Dolores Ashford, 58 and still beautiful, with the same determined set to her jaw that Margot remembered from childhood. And behind her, Colton, Margot's older brother, 35, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a three-piece suit that cost more than everything in Douglas Crane's closet combined, and Piper, her little sister, 29. A laptop bag over her shoulder, fingers already flying across her phone, and at the back of the group, moving slowly but with unmistakable dignity, Estelle Ashford, 82 years old, the family matriarch, walking with a silver-handled cane that had belonged to her own mother. Margot's entire family was walking into the courtroom. Judge Whitmore looked up. "Can I help you?" Warren Ashford stepped forward. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms like this. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Warren Ashford. I'm the father of Margot Ellison. I spent 40 years as a forensic accountant, 15 of those with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I'm here to offer expert testimony on behalf of my daughter." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Margot couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She was watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. Judge Whitmore looked at Victoria. "Counselor, did you request these witnesses?" Victoria looked equally stunned. No, Your Honor. This is unexpected." "I called them," Margot said, her voice barely audible. "An hour ago, I left a voicemail." Colton stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'm Colton Ashford. I'm a licensed attorney in this state. I'd like to request permission to join as co-counsel for Mrs. Ellison." Douglas Crane finally found his voice. "This is highly irregular. These people just walked in off the street. We have no way of verifying their credentials or intentions." "My credentials are a matter of public record," Warren said calmly, "as are my son's." "Your Honor, I understand this is unexpected, but we've just learned that my daughter is in trouble. We came as quickly as we could." Judge Whitmore studied the group for a long moment. Then she looked at Margot. "Mrs. Ellison, do you want these people here?" Margot looked at her family, her father, who she had accused of being controlling, her mother, who she had called manipulative, her brother and sister, who she had shut out for 3 years without explanation, her grandmother, who she had abandoned. They had come. The moment she called, they had come. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I want them here." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. "Given the serious nature of the allegations in this case, I'm going to allow a brief recess for Mrs. Ellison to confer with her family. We'll reconvene in 1 hour." She banged her gavel. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Margot stood on legs that felt like water. Her family was moving toward her. Her father's arms opened. Her mother was already crying. Her brother was smiling that steady smile she remembered from childhood. They gathered around her in the courtroom aisle, forming a protective circle that she didn't deserve, but needed more than she had ever needed anything. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I believed him. I believed everything he said. I shut you out. I. Shh." Her father's voice was steady. "We know, we understand, and we're here now. But I was awful. I was so awful to all of you. You were manipulated." Her mother cupped her face in both hands. "By a man who spent years learning exactly how to isolate you. That's not your fault, sweetheart. That's not your fault at all." Margot looked at her grandmother. Estelle stood slightly apart, leaning on her silver cane, watching with those sharp eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. "Grandma, I'm sorry. I never should have—" "Hush." Estelle's voice was crisp despite her age. "Your grandfather was a snake too. I know exactly what it's like to wake up one day and realize you married a monster." She stepped forward and took Margot's hand in her weathered grip. "You didn't fail, child. You survived. And now you're going to fight." Margot looked around at her family. All of them. Here for her despite everything. Here because she had asked. Here because love doesn't keep score the way she had feared. For the first time since she walked into this courthouse, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. They gathered in a small conference room that Victoria had secured. 6 members of the Ashford family, plus Margot's attorney, all crowded around a scarred wooden table covered in papers and coffee cups. Colton had taken charge immediately. He spread out the documents Douglas Crane had submitted, studying each one with the focused intensity that had made him one of Chicago's most successful litigation attorneys. "They've built a strong case," he said finally. "But it's a case made of smoke and mirrors. This psychiatrist, Dr. Matthews. Have you actually verified his credentials?" Victoria shook her head. "I checked that he exists. He has a practice in the city. Beyond that, I didn't have resources to dig deeper." "I'll handle that." Piper was already typing on her laptop. "If he's lying about evaluating Margot, there will be inconsistencies. Billing records that don't match, appointment schedules that show he was somewhere else. People like this always make mistakes." Warren was reviewing the financial documents, his reading glasses perched on his nose, pencil moving rapidly as he made notes in the margins. "These asset declarations are fiction," he said. "I can see it just from the structure. Shell companies layered inside shell companies. Transfers routed through jurisdictions known for secrecy." He looked up at Margot. "How long have you been married?" "6 years." "And when did you first notice money being moved?" Margot thought back. "I never really noticed. Brent handled all the finances. He said it was easier that way, that I shouldn't stress about it." "Financial isolation," Dolores said quietly. She had been a family court clerk for 30 years. She had seen this pattern 1,000 times. Classic abuse tactic. "Can you prove he's hiding assets?" Victoria asked Warren. "In a way that will hold up in court?" Warren exchanged a look with Colton. "We can try, but it takes time. We need access to records, subpoena power, possibly cooperation from foreign banking authorities." "We don't have time," Margot said. "They're trying to take custody before the baby is even born." The hearing continues in less than an hour. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the problem. They had arrived like cavalry charging over the hill, but the battle might already be lost. Estelle spoke up from her chair in the corner. "Tell me about this other woman, the secretary." "Tiffany?" Margot shook her head. "She won't help. She's terrified of Brent. She said he has things on her that could destroy her career." "What kind of things?" "I don't know. She didn't say." Estelle tapped her cane thoughtfully against the floor. "In my experience, women like that want to talk. They carry guilt. They know what they're participating in is wrong. They just need someone to give them permission to be honest." She seemed conflicted, Margot admitted. In the bathroom earlier, she almost said something important, but Judith interrupted. Perhaps she needs another opportunity. Estelle smiled slightly. Without interruption this time. Colton checked his watch. We have 40 minutes. Here's what we're going to do. Dad, keep reviewing those financials. Find anything that looks suspicious and document it. Piper, dig into Dr. Matthews. Find the inconsistency. Mom, you know how family court works. Walk Victoria through anything that might give us procedural leverage. What about me? Margot asked. Colton looked at her steadily. You're going to go back into that courtroom and tell the truth. You're going to sit there with your head held high while we build the case behind you. And you're not going to accept any settlement that leaves you with nothing. What if we lose? Then we appeal, and we keep appealing until we get justice. Colton's voice was firm. You're not alone anymore, Margot. You haven't been alone since the moment you left that voicemail. Margot looked around the room. Her family, working together, fighting for her. She had spent 3 years believing these people were her enemies. 3 years letting Brent's lies poison every memory of her childhood, every family gathering, every moment of love she had ever known. And now here they were, without hesitation, without reproach, ready to tear her husband's case apart, piece by piece. I don't deserve this, she said quietly. Probably not, Estelle replied. But we're doing it anyway. That's what family means. The hour passed in a blur of activity. Piper found an inconsistency in Dr. Matthews' billing records. He had charged Brent's insurance company for 6 sessions with Margot during a period when his office was closed for renovation. The lie was documented in black and white. Warren compiled a list of 12 shell companies that appeared to be connected to Brent's business. He couldn't prove asset hiding definitively, but he could demonstrate that Brent's financial declarations were incomplete at best and fraudulent at worst. Dolores identified 3 procedural irregularities in Douglas Crane's filings that could be challenged. Small things, but they added up to a pattern of sloppy shortcuts that suggested confidence bred from never being challenged. And Colton prepared a motion to admit himself as co-counsel, along with a request that Warren be recognized as an expert witness in forensic accounting. When they walked back into the courtroom, they walked in together, a united front that made Douglas Crane's confident smile flicker just slightly. Judge Whitmore reviewed Colton's credentials and granted his motion. She reviewed Warren's qualifications and agreed to hear his expert testimony with the understanding that opposing counsel would have an opportunity to cross-examine. The battle wasn't won, not even close. But for the first time, they were fighting on equal ground. Brent was no longer smiling. Warren took the stand at 3:45 in the afternoon. He answered Colton's questions with the calm precision of someone who had testified in hundreds of proceedings. Federal fraud cases, international money laundering investigations, corporate scandals that made national headlines. Based on your review of Mr. Ellison's financial declarations, Colton asked, do you believe they accurately represent his total assets? No, Warren said simply. They do not. Douglas Crane was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This witness has had less than an hour to review documents. He cannot possibly offer expert opinion on such short notice. I've spent 40 years doing exactly this, Warren replied evenly. I can spot a shell company structure in my sleep, and Mr. Ellison's declarations are riddled with them. Judge Whitmore allowed the testimony to continue. Warren walked through his findings methodically. The layered corporations, the suspicious transfer patterns, the jurisdictions chosen specifically for their opacity. In my professional opinion, Warren concluded, Mr. Ellison has hidden assets totaling at minimum several $100,000 and potentially well over $1 million. A full forensic audit would be required to determine the exact amount. Douglas attempted to discredit Warren on cross-examination. He attacked his credentials, his methodology, his objectivity as Margot's father. Warren answered every question without flinching. He cited specific cases he had worked. He explained his methodology in terms even lay people could understand. And when Douglas suggested his judgment was clouded by family loyalty, Warren looked him straight in the eye. My judgment is clouded by 40 years of experience catching people exactly like your client, he said. The patterns are obvious to anyone trained to see them. The question is whether this court wants to see them too. Judge Whitmore called for a brief recess. During the break, something unexpected happened. Tiffany Vance approached Margot in the hallway. She looked different, smaller somehow. Her carefully applied makeup was smudged beneath her eyes. "I watched your father testify," she said. "He's going to find everything, isn't he? Eventually. He's going to find all of it." Margot nodded slowly. "I think so. Yes." Tiffany was silent for a moment. She looked over her shoulder toward where Brent stood conferring with Douglas Crane. Neither man had noticed her absence. "There's another account," Tiffany said quietly. "In the Cayman Islands, over $1 million. Brent opened it 2 years ago, around the time you got pregnant." Margot's breath caught. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm tired." Tiffany's voice was barely audible. "I'm tired of helping him hurt people. I'm tired of being scared all the time. I'm tired of looking in the mirror and hating what I see. He'll destroy you if you testify. He's already destroying me." Tiffany met Margot's eyes. "The things he has on me. Emails that make it look like I helped him embezzle from a business partner. He made me send them. Said they were just for internal documentation. But they're not. They're insurance. Against me. So you're a victim too." "I'm a lot of things." Tiffany shook her head. "But I'm not going to be a coward anymore. If your family can find that account, if they can prove the money exists, I'll testify about how he set it up." "Why would you do that?" Tiffany looked at Margot's pregnant belly, at the life growing there, innocent of all the ugliness surrounding its arrival. "Because that baby deserves better," she said. "And so do you." She walked away before Margot could respond, walked right up to Brent and touched his arm like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just given Margot the key to everything. Court reconvened. Piper had already traced the account based on Tiffany's information. The money was real. The evidence was damning. When Colton presented the findings to Judge Whitmore, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted entirely. "Your Honor," Colton said, "we have documentation showing that Mr. Ellison has hidden over $1 million in an offshore account that was deliberately omitted from his financial declarations. We also have evidence that the psychiatrist who claimed to have evaluated Mrs. Ellison billed for sessions during a period when his office was physically closed. The foundation of opposing counsel's case is built entirely on fraud." Douglas Crane tried to object, tried to claim the evidence was improperly obtained, tried to argue that none of this was relevant to the custody question, but Judge Whitmore had seen enough. "Mr. Crane," she said coldly, "your client appears to have committed perjury in his financial declarations. A witness in your case appears to have provided fabricated testimony. I'm ordering all of Mr. Ellison's accounts frozen, pending a full forensic review, and I'm referring the matter of Dr. Matthews to the Medical Licensing Board for investigation." Brent finally lost control. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, standing up so quickly his chair fell backward. "That money is mine. I earned it. She just sat there, getting pregnant and spending everything I made. She doesn't deserve any of it." "Mr. Ellison," Judge Whitmore's voice was sharp as a blade. "Sit down immediately." No, I won't sit down. You don't understand what she's like. She's manipulative. She's unstable. She turned her own family against me, and now she's doing the same thing here." "Your Honor," Douglas said desperately, "my client is obviously distressed. If we could have a brief recess—" "She's crazy," Brent continued, ignoring his attorney entirely. "Ask anyone. Ask my mother. Ask Tiffany. She threatened to hurt herself. She threatened to hurt the baby. That's enough." Judge Whitmore banged her gavel. "Mr. Ellison, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Ellison from this courtroom." Two bailiffs moved forward. Brent was still shouting, as they led him through the side door. His mother started crying. Douglas Crane stood frozen, his carefully constructed case collapsing around him. Margot watched it all from her seat. Her hand rested on her belly. The baby kicked. This time, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like hope. That night, Margot sat alone in the small apartment she had been renting since moving out of the house she had shared with Brent. The apartment was sparsely furnished: a bed from a second-hand store, a couch that had seen better decades, a kitchen table where she ate her meals alone, night after night, wondering how her life had gone so wrong. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she had family. They had insisted on coming back with her after court adjourned. Her mother had made dinner from whatever was in the refrigerator, working miracles with eggs and vegetables and the single carton of milk that wasn't expired. Her father had sat at the kitchen table, still making notes, still building their case. Colton and Piper had set up a temporary office in the living room, laptops and phones and legal pads everywhere, working even now at 9 o'clock at night because the fight wasn't over yet. And Estelle had taken the most comfortable chair, watching everything with those sharp old eyes, occasionally offering observations that cut straight to the heart of whatever problem they were discussing. Margot excused herself around 10 o'clock. She was exhausted. The baby was pressing on her bladder. Her back ached. Her feet were swollen. But more than anything, she needed a moment alone to process everything that had happened. She sat on the edge of her bed in the small bedroom. The window looked out over a parking lot. Not much of a view, but it was hers. The first thing that had been truly hers in 6 years. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in." Her grandmother entered, moving slowly but steadily on her silver cane. "May I sit?" Estelle asked. Margot nodded, making room on the bed. They sat in silence for a moment. The sounds of the family working drifted through the thin walls. Voices discussing strategy, the click of keyboard keys, the shuffle of papers. "You haven't cried," Estelle observed. "Not since we arrived." "I cried enough today." "There's no such thing as enough, not when it comes to grief." Margot looked at her grandmother. "What would you know about grief? Grandpa adored you. 45 years of marriage. Everyone said you were the perfect couple." Estelle laughed softly. "Perfect, yes. That's what everyone said." She was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke again, her voice distant with memory. "Your grandfather was charming, handsome, came from the right family, said all the right things." She paused. "He also kept a mistress for 30 years. Right there in the same town. Everyone knew except me." Margot stared at her. "What?" "I found out when I was 50. Your father was already grown. My whole life was built around a man who had been lying to me since before we walked down the aisle." "Why didn't you leave?" "Where would I have gone? I had no money of my own, no career, no education beyond finishing school. He had made sure of that, made sure I was completely dependent on him." Estelle's voice was matter-of-fact. "So I stayed for another 32 years, until he died in his sleep at 81 years old. That's awful. It was what it was, a different time. different expectations. Estelle turned to look at Margot directly. But you have choices I never had. You have a family who will support you. You have an education. You have youth and strength and a whole life ahead of you. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't about feeling strong. Strength is about getting up every morning even when you want to stay in bed forever. Strength is about fighting even when you think you've already lost. Strength is about calling your family after 3 years of silence because you finally understood that pride matters less than survival. Margot felt tears threatening again. She blinked them back. I wasted so much time, she said. 3 years of believing his lies. 3 years of pushing away everyone who loved me. So you made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The question is what you do after you realize you've made them. Estelle took Margot's hand in her weathered grip. You called us. You asked for help. That took more courage than you realize. It felt like giving up. No. Giving up would be accepting that settlement and walking away. Giving up would be letting him win because fighting felt too hard. Asking for help isn't giving up. It's the opposite. It's admitting that you can't do everything alone and choosing to keep fighting anyway. They sat together in silence. Outside, a car alarm went off somewhere in the parking lot. A siren wailed in the distance. The city continued its endless motion, indifferent to the small room where a grandmother and granddaughter shared something real. The baby, Estelle said finally. Do you know if it's a boy or a girl? Margot nodded. A girl? Have you chosen a name? I was thinking about Eleanor, after your mother. Estelle was quiet for a long moment. When Margot looked at her, she saw something she had never seen before. Tears, rolling slowly down her grandmother's weathered cheeks. That's a good name, Estelle said softly. A strong name. Eleanor Rose Ashford fought for women's suffrage. She marched. She was arrested twice. She never backed down from anything in her entire life. Ellison, Margot said automatically. Eleanor Rose Ellison. Estelle shook her head firmly. No, not Ellison. That man's name doesn't deserve to be attached to this child. When you divorce him, and you will divorce him, you take back your maiden name, and you give this little girl a name that means something. Eleanor Rose Ashford. That's better. Estelle squeezed Margot's hand. Much better. Margot leaned against her grandmother. The old woman smelled like lavender and wool and something indefinable that meant safety, that meant home. I was so scared, Margot whispered. For so long, I was so scared. I know, child, I know. I thought I was alone. You were never alone. You just couldn't see us through all the lies he built around you. Estelle stroked her hair gently. But you see us now, and we're not going anywhere. Not ever again. They stayed that way for a long time, grandmother and granddaughter, two women who had married snakes and survived to tell the tale. In the other room, the family kept working, building the case that would destroy Brent Ellison's carefully constructed facade. And in the small bedroom, Margot finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The next morning brought unexpected news. Tiffany Vance wanted to talk. She had called Victoria Hayes at 6 in the morning, barely 12 hours after whispering her secret in the courthouse hallway. She sounded scared but determined. She wanted to make a formal statement. By 8 o'clock, she was sitting in Victoria's office, facing Margot's entire family across a conference table. She looked smaller than Margot remembered. Without the careful professional armor of makeup and designer clothes, she looked almost fragile. 28 years old, blonde hair, pulled back in a simple ponytail, dark circles under her eyes that suggested a sleepless night. Before I say anything, Tiffany began, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I'm a good person. I'm doing this because I'm tired of being a bad one. Warren nodded slowly. We appreciate your honesty. I started working for Brent 4 years ago. Personal assistant. He was charming, successful, paid well. She looked down at her hands. He was also married to a woman he never stopped talking about. How beautiful she was, how kind, how lucky he was. Margot felt something twist in her chest. She had forgotten there was a time when Brent spoke of her that way. He started confiding in me after about a year, said things weren't going well at home, said Margot was becoming difficult, controlling, that her family was putting pressure on the marriage. Tiffany's voice was quiet but steady. I believed him. I wanted to believe him because by then, I was already in love with him. When did the affair begin? Colton asked. 18 months ago. He told me he was going to leave her, that he just needed time to get his affairs in order, that they had complicated finances, and he wanted to make sure everything was settled properly. Tiffany laughed bitterly. I was so stupid. Getting his affairs in order meant hiding money. Settling finances meant making sure Margot would get nothing in the divorce he had already planned. Tell us about the offshore accounts. Tiffany explained. Brent had been moving money for at least 2 years, small amounts at first, then larger and larger transfers as the divorce approached. He had shell companies in Delaware, Nevada, the Cayman Islands, and the British Virgin Islands. He had cryptocurrency wallets that weren't connected to any bank. The total? Warren asked. I don't know exactly, but at least $2 million, maybe more. Tiffany looked at Margot directly for the first time. He was never going to share any of it. Not with you, not with me, not with anyone. You mentioned he has something on you, Margot said. Emails that make you look complicit. Tiffany nodded. He made me send them, said they were just internal documentation, invoice approvals, transfer authorizations, but the way they're worded, it looks like I was embezzling from his business partner. If those emails ever became public, I could go to prison. We can protect you, Colton said. If you're willing to testify truthfully, we can work with the prosecutor to ensure you're treated as a cooperating witness rather than a co-conspirator. Can you guarantee that? No, but I can guarantee that Brent will destroy you eventually regardless. Men like him don't share power. They use people until there's nothing left to use, and then they discard them. Tiffany was quiet for a long moment. She looked around the room, at Warren with his notes and calculations, at Dolores with her knowledge of family court procedure, at Colton and Piper and their technological arsenal, at Estelle, watching everything with those sharp, knowing eyes, and at Margot, 8 months pregnant, betrayed, fighting for everything. There's something else, Tiffany said finally, something I didn't mention yesterday. Everyone leaned forward slightly. Brent has another girlfriend, not just me, someone he started seeing about 6 months ago. I found out by accident. Saw texts on his phone he didn't know I saw. Margot closed her eyes. Another affair. On top of the affair. Layers of betrayal, stacking on layers of betrayal. Does she know about me? Tiffany asked. Does she know about you? I don't think so. I think he's running the same play with her that he ran with both of us. The charming victim, the misunderstood husband. Who is she? Her name is Amanda something. She works at the bank where he has one of his accounts. That's how they met. Warren made a note. A bank employee could be very useful as a witness if she's willing to cooperate. I don't know if she will, but she deserves to know what kind of man she's involved with. Tiffany straightened in her chair. So, what do you need from me? Colton outlined what they were looking for. Testimony about the hidden accounts. Documentation of the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Any communications between Brent and Douglas Crane that showed intent to deceive the court. Tiffany agreed to everything. She signed papers. She handed over files she had quietly copied over the past 6 months. She answered question after question with the exhausted relief of someone finally setting down a burden they had carried too long. By noon, they had more than enough to destroy Brent's case entirely. But Margot wasn't focused on destruction. She was focused on something Tiffany had said hours earlier. He was also married to a woman he never stopped talking about. How beautiful she was. How kind. How lucky he was. Once, long ago, Brent had loved her. Or at least, he had loved the idea of her. The trophy wife. The beautiful possession. The woman who reflected well on his success. When had that changed? When had she stopped being something to treasure and started being something to discard? Maybe it had never been real. Maybe even in the beginning, even when he was talking about how lucky he had been calculating, planning, turning her into another asset to be liquidated when the time was right. She would never know for certain. And maybe that was okay, because it didn't matter why Brent had become a monster. What mattered was that she had finally stopped being his victim. The final hearing came 3 weeks later. Margot had spent those weeks preparing, resting when the baby demanded it, reviewing documents with her family, practicing her testimony with Colton until she could tell her story clearly and calmly without breaking down. She had also spent time healing, long conversations with her mother about everything that had happened, quiet evenings with her father, who didn't need to talk, but whose presence said more than words ever could. Dinners with Piper and Colton, catching up on 3 years of missed birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments, and one afternoon with Sloane, her best friend who had finally explained everything. Brent had shown up at her office 9 months ago. He had made threats, implied he could destroy her career with a single phone call. Told her that if she ever contacted Margot again, he would make sure she regretted it. I was terrified, Sloane admitted. He was so calm, so certain, like ruining someone's life was just another item on his to-do list. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. That text I sent, the one about him threatening me, I thought if I could just get you to call me, I could explain everything. He was monitoring my phone. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I just knew that you never responded, and I was too scared to try again. Margot had forgiven her immediately. How could she not? Sloane had been threatened by the same man who had threatened everyone, the same man who had built an empire of fear and manipulation that stretched into every corner of Margot's life. But that empire was crumbling. When court reconvened, Brent was not the confident man he had been 3 weeks earlier. His expensive suits couldn't hide the circles under his eyes. His charming smile couldn't cover the tension in his jaw. Douglas Crane had tried to withdraw from the case twice, both times. Brent had refused. He couldn't find another attorney willing to take the case on such short notice. He was stuck with a lawyer who no longer believed he could win. The evidence against Brent was overwhelming. Warren testified for 2 hours about the hidden assets, $2.3 million in total, scattered across accounts and shell companies that Brent had sworn did not exist. Piper presented digital evidence that had been recovered from deleted emails and encrypted files, communications between Brent and Dr. Matthews discussing how much the fake evaluation would cost. Messages to Tiffany, planning exactly how to make Margot look unstable. Tiffany herself took the stand. She answered every question honestly, her voice steady despite the fear that must have been churning inside her. She confirmed the affair. She confirmed the financial manipulation. She confirmed that Brent had told her Margot was dangerous and unstable, even though she had never seen any evidence of that. "What made you decide to come forward?" Colton asked her. Tiffany looked at Margot. Because I looked at her and saw myself, someone who believed his lies, someone who thought she was special while he was planning to throw her away. She paused. I couldn't let him do to her baby what he did to both of us. Douglas Crane attempted a cross-examination, but his heart wasn't in it. Every question he asked seemed to make things worse for his client. Every objection was overruled, and then it was Brent's turn. He insisted on testifying in his own defense. Douglas tried to talk him out of it. Colton could see the attorney practically begging his client to stay silent. But Brent had always believed he was the smartest person in any room. He had always believed he could talk his way out of anything. He was wrong. Under Colton's cross-examination, Brent's facade crumbled completely. Mr. Ellison, did you tell your wife that her family was toxic and controlling? I was trying to protect her. From what? From their influence. They were always interfering. Interfering how? They didn't trust me. They were always asking questions about our finances, about our plans. Is that perhaps because you were hiding assets from your wife while planning to divorce her? Objection, Douglas called weakly. Overruled. I wasn't hiding anything. Those accounts are legitimate business holdings. Business holdings that you deliberately omitted from your financial declarations? Brent's composure slipped. Those declarations are complicated. Things get left out. $2.3 million got left out by accident? You don't understand how business works. I understand how fraud works, Mr. Ellison, and I understand how perjury works, and I understand how a man who thinks he's smarter than everyone else eventually makes the mistake of believing his own lies. Brent stood up so suddenly that his chair fell backward. The same thing that had happened 3 weeks ago. The same loss of control. This is a setup, he shouted. All of this. Her family comes in at the last minute with their forensic accountants and their lawyers, and suddenly I'm the villain. She was the problem. She was always the problem. I gave her everything, and she... Sit down, Mr. Ellison. Brent ignored Judge Whitmore. She trapped me with that pregnancy. Did anyone ask about that? She said she was on birth control. She lied. She wanted to lock me down. She wanted... Bailiff. 2 officers moved forward. Brent kept shouting as they escorted him from the courtroom. His mother was crying again. Douglas Crane looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Whitmore waited until the doors closed behind Brent. Then she turned to face the room. I've heard enough, she said. I'm prepared to issue my ruling. Margot reached for Victoria's hand on one side and her mother's on the other. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. In the matter of asset division, Judge Whitmore continued, I find that Mr. Ellison deliberately concealed assets from this court. I am ordering the full $2.3 million in hidden accounts, frozen and divided equitably between the parties. Given Mr. Ellison's fraudulent behavior, I am awarding Mrs. Ellison 70% of all marital assets. Margot heard the words, but couldn't quite process them. 70%, over $1.5 million. In the matter of custody, Judge Whitmore said, I am awarding full custody to Mrs. Ellison. Based on the evidence presented, Mr. Ellison demonstrates a pattern of manipulation, deception, and emotional abuse that renders him unfit for unsupervised contact with a minor. Supervised visitation may be revisited in 6 months, pending completion of a court-ordered psychological evaluation and parenting classes. Full custody. The words echoed in Margot's mind. Full custody. Additionally, Judge Whitmore continued, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential fraud and perjury charges. I am also recommending that Dr. Gerald Matthews face investigation by the Medical Licensing Board for providing fabricated testimony. She looked directly at the space where Brent had been sitting. Mister. Ellison believed he could manipulate this court the way he manipulated his wife. He was wrong. This court will not be an instrument of abuse. The gavel came down. Final, decisive. A sound like the end of one story and the beginning of another. Margot's family surrounded her immediately. Her mother was crying. Her father had his arm around her shoulders. Colton and Piper were grinning. Estelle stood slightly apart, leaning on her cane, Mahan nodding with grim satisfaction. Victoria was shaking Warren's hand, thanking him for his expertise, and Margot stood in the middle of all of it, one hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. She had walked into this courthouse alone 3 weeks ago, powerless, terrified, certain she was about to lose everything. Now she had won. Not just the case, not just the money or the custody. She had won back herself. Eleanor Rose Ashford was born on a Tuesday morning in March. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, 10 fingers, 10 toes. A cry that filled the delivery room with the undeniable presence of new life. Margot held her daughter for the first time and felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated, overwhelming joy. The delivery room was crowded, her mother holding her hand through the contractions, her father pacing in the hallway because he couldn't handle watching his daughter in pain. Piper documenting everything on her phone because the Ashfords documented everything. Colton on speakerphone from Chicago because court kept him from flying in. And Estelle, sitting in a chair in the corner, watching, remembering perhaps another delivery room, decades ago, when she had held her own first child. She's perfect, Dolores whispered, tears streaming down her face. Oh, Margot, she's absolutely perfect. Margot couldn't speak. She could only hold her daughter and marvel at the impossibility of it all. A year ago, she had been trapped in a marriage to a man who was systematically destroying her. 6 months ago, she had been alone in a courthouse bathroom, sobbing on the cold tile floor, certain she had lost everything. Now she had a daughter, a family, a future. The nurse asked what name to put on the birth certificate. Eleanor Rose Ashford, Margot said. Her voice was hoarse from the delivery, but the words were clear, not Ellison. Never Ellison. Ashford. A name that meant something. A name that belonged to women who fought and survived and never gave up. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of sleepless nights and feeding schedules and the overwhelming intensity of caring for a newborn. But Margot wasn't doing it alone. Her mother stayed for the first 2 weeks. Then her sister took over. Then Sloane, who had appointed herself godmother without asking permission. Even Estelle visited regularly, holding Eleanor with the practiced ease of someone who had raised 4 children and watched over 12 grandchildren. She has your eyes, Estelle observed during one visit. And your stubbornness, I can tell already. Margot laughed. How can you tell she's stubborn? She's 3 weeks old. She refused to be born until she was ready. 41 weeks. She was comfortable where she was. Estelle smiled. That's stubbornness. The legal matters were slowly resolving. Brent had been charged with fraud and perjury. His business empire was crumbling as partners and investors fled. His mother had stopped speaking to him entirely after the full extent of his deceptions became public. Tiffany had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. She had moved to another city, started over. Margot wished her well, genuinely. They had both been victims of the same man. They had both survived. Dr. Matthews had lost his medical license. The neighbor who testified falsely had been charged with perjury as well, though she was unlikely to face serious consequences. And Brent himself? Last Margot heard, he was awaiting trial on multiple felony charges. Bail had been set at $500,000. His mother had refused to pay it. Margot didn't think about him much anymore. He had occupied so much space in her mind for so long, now he occupied almost none. She had better things to think about, like Eleanor's first smile, like the farmhouse her parents had helped her buy in the countryside outside the city, like the garden she was planning to plant in the spring, like the life she was finally building for herself. One evening in April, she stood on the porch of that farmhouse watching the sunset. Eleanor slept in a bassinet nearby, making the small sounds that babies make when they're dreaming of whatever babies dream of. Sloane had visited earlier and left flowers on the kitchen table. Her parents had called to check in. Piper had sent a video of some technical thing she was excited about that Margot didn't understand but appreciated anyway. She wasn't alone. She would never be alone again. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. The air smelled like fresh earth and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its evening song. Margot thought about everything that had brought her here, the pain, the betrayal, the moment in that courthouse bathroom when she had felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She thought about the voicemail she had left for her father, the most terrifying thing she had ever done, the thing that had saved her. She thought about her family walking through those courtroom doors, about her father's calm testimony, about her grandmother's silver cane and sharp eyes, and the story she had shared about her own snake of a husband. She thought about Tiffany, finding courage in the last place anyone would have expected. She thought about all the people who had shown up when it mattered, who had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, who had reminded her that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was strength, the hardest kind of strength there was. Eleanor stirred in her bassinet, made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a cry, or might have been nothing at all. Margot reached down and lifted her daughter into her arms. Such a small thing, such a miraculous thing. "Hey there, little one," she whispered. "Did you see the sunset? It's beautiful tonight." Eleanor's eyes were open now, dark and unfocused, the way newborn eyes always are. But she seemed to be looking at her mother, seemed to be listening. "I'm going to tell you something," Margot said softly. "Something important, something I wish someone had told me a long time ago." She settled into the rocking chair on the porch. The chair creaked gently as she moved. Eleanor's eyes started to drift closed again. You are never alone, even when it feels like you are, even when someone tries to make you believe you are. There are people who love you, people who will come when you call, people who will fight for you even when you've forgotten how to fight for yourself. The baby was asleep now. Margot kept rocking anyway, kept talking to the sunset and the evening air and her own heart. Your great-grandmother, Eleanor, fought for things she believed in. Your grandmother survived a marriage to a liar. Your aunts and uncle and grandfather will move mountains for you without even being asked. And me, she paused, looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. I will burn the world down for you if I have to, but more importantly, I'll teach you that you can burn it down yourself, that you're strong, that you're brave, that asking for help makes you more powerful, not less. The last light of the sunset faded from the sky. Stars began to appear, one by one, like promises being made. They thought I was powerless, Margot said to the darkness. They thought they had won. She smiled, the first real smile she had given herself in longer than she could remember. They were wrong. And that is the story of Margot Ellison, a woman who walked into a courtroom alone and walked out surrounded by everyone who ever loved her. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength, if it made you think of someone who needs to hear it, please share it with them. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever had to ask for help when you thought you could not? Have you ever been the person who showed up when someone needed you most? Your story matters. We want to hear it. If you are new here, consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. We share stories like this every week. Stories of strength, stories of survival, stories that remind us what it means to be human. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, you are never as alone as they want you to believe. Final disclaimer. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team. Every story we create is designed to bring meaningful lessons and emotional value to our viewers. We believe in the power of storytelling to heal, to inspire, and to remind us all that we are stronger than we know. Thank you for watching.